In the US, emergency services are sometimes provided not by paid workers, but by volunteers, and which one it is can differ depending on where you are. This chart shows that in urban areas, the majority of emergency medical services agencies are staffed entirely by paid employees. In the more isolated rural areas of the US, it's the complete opposite. These are the regions of the US that need volunteers for their emergency services to run. But there's a problem. Back in 1984, there were nearly 900,000 volunteer firefighters in the US. By 2020, that number had dropped by more than 220,000. When you consider the US population grew by 100 million people during that time, that's almost a 50% decline per capita. The US, especially in its small towns, needs more volunteers than it has. This isn't a sudden crisis. It's been unraveling for decades.
This is not something that just popped up overnight. These wheels were set in motion going all the way back to the 60s and 70s.
The new fire station in town is manned entirely by volunteers, people who give their time to a community service.
Almost 70% of rural EMS providers have reported having difficulty in recruiting volunteers.
And now the community is looking around, realizing that they got a free ride for the first 30 or 40 years. And now, how do we backfill it?
So, why are small town volunteers, once the backbone of emergency response, disappearing?
Hi, this is the third of 3 videos we're doing on how emergency help gets to remote places. Rural parts of the U.S. often struggle to get the same services as more populated regions. We wanted to explore what those challenges look like and what might be done to make things better. And we're grateful to our sponsor, T-Mobile, for supporting this video. T-Mobile has invested billions to bring 5G coverage across the U.S., and they're committed to supporting first responders and their families with exclusive savings. You can learn more at the link below. T-Mobile didn't dictate the content of this video, but they did make our reporting possible. Thanks, and back to the video.
The first clue to why this is happening might be in the fact that emergency volunteers in the U.S. are increasingly older.
They might have been there when the ambulance service started in 1982. They're getting to be 70, 80 years old now.
And that's especially true in rural areas. In towns under 2,500 people, roughly 1 in 3 firefighters is over 50. In 1987, that used to be 1 in 6. If younger people aren't signing up, it means something is making becoming a volunteer today different than what it was in the past. So why is it so hard to recruit young volunteers today?
A lot of the volunteer fire departments in general were kind of family-based organizations, and really they were social clubs for many years.
That's how it started for Randall Hannafin, now the assistant fire chief of Westchester, Ohio, and a fire and EMS consultant. One thing I heard from a lot of people is that volunteering itself has changed from the way it was a few decades ago.
You and I could be qualified to go out and run on an ambulance with very little training.
But as emergency medicine advanced, so did the expectations. What used to be basic first aid and transport is now complex, higher stakes care.
But to get that, it takes on additional training. And some volunteers, they didn't have the time to do that.
To become an EMT today, it takes about 150 hours of training. A firefighter, 120 hours. An emergency responder, just basic life-saving care like CPR and first aid, still takes 48 hours. A week's worth of labor is 40 hours. So training to become an EMT would be like doing nearly 3 weeks of work for free in the case of volunteers. And that's if you drop everything else and just train for 8 hours a day. In reality, that training is often squeezed in around full-time jobs and family life.
You have one commodity as a laborer in the workforce in the United States, and that's your time. So why would you give it away?
Volunteering is simply more demanding than it used to be. But volunteering isn't the only thing that's changed.
It's become so expensive to live these days. You have dual income families. There's just literally no time left to come in and volunteer.
And on top of that, there are fewer people to do the volunteering. This map color codes every rural county in the US. Green if it gained population from 2010 to 2020. Red if it lost population. It's a mostly red map. 2/3 of all rural counties lost population during that time because more people moved out than moved in. Births diminished and deaths increased. And a big part of that loss is young people.
Young Americans growing up don't want to stay in rural America. They're looking for a more urbanized lifestyle and have access to all the rest of that. Off they go.
But even for the young people that are still in small towns, life is different than it was a few decades ago.
People are not joining organizations at the same rates as they used to. Religious congregations, service organizations, all of these kind of clubs and associations that give people a place to belong.
As you have more and more technology, used to you had to go hang out with your friends somewhere. Well, that may have been the fire department. Well, now, with proliferation of all the phones and social media, like you don't need to leave your living room to hang out with your friends every day.
And the data backs Randall up. In 2023, young Americans spend 6 hours alone per day. Nothing else. Time spent with coworkers, friends, partners, and even family comes close. So what now? How can we try to fix the issue? Some people talk to me about recognition.
We get our local newspaper and put a spotlight on our volunteers. That's what they want. We've got to show the volunteers that we need them.
But some communities in the US are going further, offering stipends, tuition reimbursements, and tax credits to volunteers. Even free housing, like in parts of Pennsylvania and Maryland. Others are reorganizing completely.
A lot of times, because they're such small rural communities, I always say the tax base per square mile doesn't equate to enough to afford paid people. So a lot of times you're forced to look at regionalization of a system.
Regionalization means this. Instead of each small town trying to fund its own ambulance or fire crew, neighboring towns pool resources, money, staffing, equipment into one shared set of services. That can mean fewer stations, but better coverage. One thing I heard from several people, though, is that ultimately, the best option might be the simplest one.
We never look around and say, you know what, somebody ought to volunteer to do that. We ought to have volunteer physicians. We ought to have volunteer nurses. And yet we continue to try to prop up this model that is just fractured and it's falling apart.
Today, the value of a volunteer's time is estimated at over $34.79 an hour. If you consider that towns need 24/7 staff,
And the numbers start to rack up. The highest cost in any ambulance service, rural or urban, is personnel and their labor and benefits. And that has been donated for 4 decades by the volunteers.
and that's why many experts believe the answer isn't recruiting more volunteers, it's paying people. Take Randall, for example.
I started to volunteer. I think I lasted as a volunteer all 6 months because they were willing to pay me to work shifts. So, getting paid seemed much better than volunteering.
Since then, he's gone full-time and now helps departments make the shift from volunteer to paid systems. But without support from the state and federal government, there's a ceiling.
When you're sending a lot of money to the federal system or the state system, there should be some give back at the state and federal level.
Much like what happens with our roads or schools.
If we can be a little more proactive, I think we'll do a whole lot better for the people that live in rural America.
In the absence of a paid emergency workforce, though, American small towns have no choice but to keep relying on volunteers for much of their emergency response. The question is, what happens if that assistance isn't there anymore?